This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.
The young shining cuckoo is fed by its foster parents on insects and spiders. But the korimako, or bellbird, has a much more interesting diet of nectar. It's been something of a radio personality and has sung on shortwave radio to Australia and the Pacific nations for 30 years. However, the early recordings failed to reflect the versatility of the bellbird, with its wide variety of liquid notes and artistically placed clicks and bell-like sounds. It's not surprising that Maori mythology describes korimako, the bellbird, as the messenger of Tane, sent to herald the coming of the sun.
Community or chaos? We can construct and nurture community or fall into chaos. Over the next hour, Marvin Hubbard hosts conversations toward creating a fairer, more equal society.
Community or Chaos is made possible with the support of Quakers Aotearoa. You'll find them online at quaker.org.nz.
Good day, friends. We're having Tim G on this morning, and we'll be talking about Quakers and Quakerism because Tim G is the secretary of the Friends World Committee for Consultation, which is the sort of the executive committee of Friends, but it's all less vertical than most executive committees. And it works by consensus, not only within itself, but I think with other groups of friends, which vary a lot. Well, Tim, could you first talk about how you became secretary of the Friends World Committee? Might be a start, because most people wouldn't.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, so shall I start with what Quakers are and then work through to how I became secretary?
Okay. That you could talk for an hour for the first part.
Well, indeed.
No,
I'll see if
5 minutes.
Quakers are one of the historic peace churches, been around for nearly 400 years, just under that. Relatively non-hierarchical in the way that we organize, committed to we have a direct experience of the divine. And that often leads us to try to make the world a better place. Quakers are non-hierarchical, but we are also widely spread in about 100 countries. That means that we need a committee to try and maintain some kind of cohesiveness and connection. So that's the committee that I look after, the Friends World Committee. And I became the secretary by applying for the job when it came up. And it was a very long, very thorough process that took nearly a year. But the Friends World Committee, which is made up of people from all around the world, decided that they would like me to be their secretary and their servant. So that's the role that I'm doing now. And part of that role involves talking about Quakers to people around the world, about Quakers around the world. And it's a delight to do that with you.
Well, you must have been fairly committed to apply for the position, actually. It's not an easy job. You have to travel a lot, and there are various sections that you have to try to get consensus or at least understanding and agreement. Yeah.
I've been a Quaker all my life. I think that something very special happens in a Quaker meeting. And I'd like to make that experience available to a wider group of people. You don't have to be a Quaker to come to a Quaker meeting. You can just come and drink from the well. That's a metaphor.
Well, we're talking about Quaker meetings.
It's a metaphorical Quaker well, and I think it can refresh us through the week. So it's a joy to work with people who look after these Quaker wells around the place and who invite people to drink from them.
Okay, can I talk about the Quaker well in Dunedin?
Great, please do.
Quaker well in Dunedin is 15 Park Street, which is just above the All Night Dairy, and it's on Sunday at 10:30, and everybody is quite welcome.
Wonderful.
If you want to uh, dip your hand in the water, so to speak.
That's lovely.
So, what does meeting for worship mean to you?
Yes. So Quakers Quakers in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as well as in Britain, meet in silence. It's a wonderful contemplative experience. There's a lot of religions and parts of Christianity that would have an aspect of silence in the way that they operate, but Quakers really just put it very front and center. It's a very open space, and it's a way to pray which is different to a way that people might be used to. I think maybe a lot of people think that praying is about articulating our desires to God in a particular way with the expectation of something in return. Whereas I would understand a Quaker meeting as a space in which we open our hearts to the divine to see where the divine might lead us. And we often see God in our neighbor. So that often leads us to trying to help people around us in various ways. That's been my experience of it, and I think that kind of tallies with the stories of Quakers over time, and it helps explain why Quakers are probably better known for our actions than our worship. But there is a spiritual practice at the heart of it.
I think I've just learned something over the last 2 years because I've had a lot to do with the small Palestinian community because of Gaza. And I think what I experience is that empathy comes from God. Is that a possibility?
What comes from God, sir?
Empathy.
Empathy comes from God. Well, I think everything comes from God, so I'm sure empathy does too.
Well, empathy is something that I didn't necessarily choose and can't ignore. I think some things come more directly from God than other things.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
If you were a young person, young people may face problems that I didn't face 40 years ago, like climate change, the environment, really struggling to cope with humanity's or corporate greed, and politics and the rule of law crumbling a bit. Could you talk about what Quakerism and maybe what Christianity might say to our environmental degradation and our economic ideology of material growth? And I wonder about greed. I used to think it was basically corporate greed and capital, and I still think that's true, but I wonder if it hasn't come from a deeper place, that our drive in more than the last 100 years for total individual autonomy, that we don't want to be dependent on anything but ourselves, in theory, for many people. And certainly that's the kind of really popular program for many groups. What do you think about that?
Yeah. I mean, I certainly think it's true that we're facing some awful existential struggles at the moment. I also think it's likely that if I look at every generation in my family, so I'm about 40, every generation seems to have had some kind of global existential struggle that's made people ask questions about themselves, their communities, the universe, and God. My great-grandfather fought in the First World War. My grandfather was a conscientious objector and an ambulance worker in the Second World War. My mum was part of the anti-nuclear movement, and there was plenty of evidence, most of which was produced by governments and shared with people, about the imminence of the possibility of a nuclear wipeout. And now this generation has a number of similar challenges to navigate, especially regarding climate change, but also the profit motive, greed, and the way that this is leading to war and more war. I was reading some Quaker literature back from 1920. The first World Conference of Quakers was in 1920. And I find Quaker minutes and literature from that time absolutely fascinating because it's utterly relatable. There are people way back then, more than 100 years ago, saying that if we stick with the profit motive, if we stick with enmity, if we stick with, stereotyping the Germans rather than helping them after the First World War, is going to lead to another war. They were saying that way back in 1920. And they were talking about there's a line that sticks with me that we fought a war to end wars, and now we have a peace to end peace. That was how they described it in 1920. That seems very relatable to what's happened since. Again and again and again and again, generation after generation, the powers that be have chosen greed over loving their neighbor. And Jesus teaches that we need to love our neighbor rather than focusing on greed. So it's the same answer throughout all the generations. It keeps not being learnt in some ways because it keeps leading to more problems as people don't follow this basic commandment. But there always have been people who've stood by the words of Jesus, who've felt the Spirit of God and acted on it, and have acted to try and help their neighbours. And I hope that we will continue in that tradition. And whilst the world is always going to have catastrophic and apocalyptic disasters, the world hasn't ended yet, and I don't think it's going to end in my lifetime. And we need to plan and believe that this world does have a future, and we need to plan to be good ancestors in it.
One of the things that I guess shocked me is I'm older than you, as you can tell. We're on Zoom. And I grew up under the shadow, to some extent, of the Holocaust. When I was about 6 or so, I saw black and white pictures in a den of a house where my family was staying with their good friends. And he'd been a Jewish soldier who liberated Dachau. And also, I thought with the United Nations and the Marshall Plan that in some ways we did learn from World War I. It's just that we've forgotten.
Yeah.
I don't mean that everything was, you had the Cold War and you had colonization in South and Central America, but there was a real effort to have a rule of law and to have aid, and certainly the Marshall Plan made a difference for Europe, and you had Scandinavia. And I never thought I'd see the rise of fascism again, or genocide coming from Israel, which was a big shocker for me. How do we, what stage is Quakerism in, and what can we offer?
In amongst all of this chaos, something that I'm grateful to the Quakers for is being stable, reliable, predictable. It's still there. It's still a place I can go. It's still a place you can go. It's still a place listeners can go, which has been around for hundreds of years. We intend to be around for hundreds more years. And we intend to help each other through this and help our neighbours as much as possible through this. we've, for years, we've tried to build the institutions of peace alongside many others. We've been a very small part of that building. We've tried to maintain them. We've tried to promote them, things like the UN, and they are under unprecedented attack right now. But we're doing our best to stand by them.
One of the
Quakers.
places where it gives me hope is QNO. Can you talk about QNO and climate change?
I was at the Quaker United Nations office in Geneva just 10 days ago.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about QNO, and then tell us about efforts to keep the idea of mitigating climate change alive.
Well, the Quaker United Nations office has been around for about as long as we've had the UN. One of the first things Quakers did once there was a UN was to set up an office to engage with it. There's one in Geneva, there's one in New York, which are the two kind of historic geographical centers of the UN, although there are more now. And it engages with the UN on all kinds of important issues, like peace, like climate change, like disarmament. It also provides a space for diplomats to come together and make human connections with one another. It gets called quiet diplomacy. So it's seeing the human behind the position and supporting them to act with humanity. So yeah, it's a great organization. I think you're prompting me to talk a little bit about the climate change work. Most of the major climate change conferences of recent times, Quakers have been represented at. There's a particular representative called Lindsay Fielder Cook, who is the face of that and the voice of that alongside others. And, there are pieces of UN text that have been shaped by the interventions that she has made on behalf of Quakers worldwide. That comes from a mandate that she got from which QNO got from a world conference to work on climate change, and actually several since in 2012. Also the World Conference after that, and the most recent World Conference in 2024 have all talked about climate change, have all reaffirmed this concern that we have that, whatever theological or ideological or political or linguistic or traditional differences we might have, we all share a planet and we think that we should protect it. So actually concern for climate change is one of the things that unites Quakers around the world in our diversity. And it's something that's happening at the UN in our name, thanks to that message that we've sent.
Do friends have as much in common as we have in diversity?
I think there are about three things that connect Quakers around the world. One is a common history. We do come from a common root. There's a story that can be traced of how one thing led to another. We also have that experience of a direct relationship with the divine. So it doesn't have to be mediated by sacraments or by people or by ordained priests or whatever. Now, some Quakers do actually choose to use outward sacraments, but they're more kind of signs or signals rather than kind of absolutely necessary for a direct relationship with the divine. And the third one is the work for justice and peace. It's happening everywhere. Now, there's a lot of space for diversity within that. But, I've said it many times that if there were a faith that were only those three things, I'd still be interested in it. And it's just a joy to see how that's manifested in different ways, sometimes radically different ways around the world.
Friends in Africa particularly have actually had to live their peace testimony in Burundi, Rwanda. I remember meeting a young man from Burundi that became a Quaker because of experiencing the genocide there. And the work for reconciliation. It's one thing in ordinary situations to reconcile differences. It's quite a different thing to reconcile differences when you've experienced ethnic cleansing in a severe way. Yet that work went on.
The work's continuing. And there's an organization called Trauma Healing and Reconciliation Services in Burundi that's still bringing people together, because we recognize, Quakers recognize, alongside really anyone else who's very serious about peace and about war, that wars don't just start and wars don't just stop. There are steps that lead to them and the steps that lead away from them and the steps that can lead back to them. So a lot of the work that Quakers do is trying to remove the causes of war. But what's happening in Burundi, as well as Rwanda and other places, is making sure that we carry on walking away from it. And that means trauma healing and reconciliation. And that's something that Quakers, amongst others, are part of. And I've also met people doing that. And it's really amazing work. The individuals, if involved, have, on the whole, lived through it. They've got their own personal stories, some way of engaging. And they support other people that have lived through it too and try to stop it from happening again.
One of the things that I think most people can agree is, or at least question, is that it seems to me that the liberal idea of automatic progress, a stairway to heaven, you might say, only totally put up by human beings, that we would have automatic progress, and that basically liberalism was to some extent based on that. Now, I think people are wondering about where we're going, and if liberalism, as traditionally thought of, is the future.
Yeah.
I mean, and also, where does this leave unprogrammed liberal Quakerism?
Yeah, I mean, I remember learning at university that liberal means a lot of different things to different people. It's one of the more ill-defined of the adjectives used for the different political ideologies. And it's one that's been kind of assigned to the type of Quakerism that's practiced in New Zealand and Australia and Britain, amongst other countries. There only have been liberal Quakers for about a century. Before that, we were not particularly liberal at all. There was a lot of rules, certainly within the community, and some of them I think we regret having had since, like rules about banning marrying out and so on. It was quite, rule-based, quite, I don't know, illiberal within the community, at least. My understanding of liberalism is that we achieve maximum freedom within some boundaries, and that the boundaries are when we infringe on other people's freedom. And that idea, I think, it appeared to be popular in some parts of the world for some time, for some decades, in recent decades, and it does seem to be receding right now. And I think an assumption that I might have had, that progress is linear and will carry on in this direction, I think has been very clearly proved incorrect. All kinds of alternatives are possible and are rising, and some of them are already in power. And I think facing up to that and recognizing that will make me better able to navigate these times that we're in. But I don't really navigate according to a political ideology. My Quakerism is about following the leadings of the spirit. That is the voice in the conscience, the direction that comes from my heart that I recognize as God. And that's the way, that's my compass. rather than something called liberalism.
It seems to me our what we see in the world and how we see things, including the past, is through whatever ideology we have. And for most English and New Zealand friends, that is liberalism. Like when people talk about John Woolman, who was a Quaker abolitionist, probably had a huge influence on the abolition of slavery. Also had quite radical ideas for any time about the economics, because he got out of business because it got in the way of his spiritual life. Yet people talk about him like he was a liberal. Well, he wasn't any kind of liberal that you'd recognize. Now, his mandate came from his belief in Jesus Christ. His listening came from both reading the Bible and listening to a divine spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And he had the support of most of his meeting, and his essays were funded by his yearly meeting publishing committee. So he was quite a different friend than what you'd recognize today. When he was toward middle age, he had the experience of losing himself and being born again, but also seeing that in this identification with Christ, he was identifying with slaves, with minors, with the most oppressed people in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure that's how many people think of social justice.
I think it's true that that's not how many modern Quakers think. And I think that's what we need to get back to if we're going to have the inward power to get through the awful challenges that are being thrown at us right now. An ideology in our head is not going to give us the answers. The movement of the spirit in our hearts, I think, will. And I think John Woolman, who's celebrated as one of the Quaker pioneers of anti-slavery, amongst other causes, is a wonderful example of that.
His entire focus was trying to discern what the divine wanted him to do.
Yep.
We're following a divine spirit anyway. And well, what would you say, why would young people come to Friends meeting? And what can we find there?
Well, I think I might have shared last time we spoke, at least in Britain, young people are finding their way to Quakerism there's been an interesting increase in the last couple of years. It hasn't showed up in the stats yet, but certainly in the stories. And so for some people, especially young parents, people want to bring up their children in a space where they can be reassured of good values. That is a strong draw for young parents, where they can be fairly confident that in a Quaker community, their children will be surrounded by people who think deeply about the world and who want to help others, rather than people who are going to preach some kind of hate towards people who are different from us. Now, especially in the countries with liberal Quakerism, lots of LGBTQ plus people coming to Quakers. Quakers are one of the denominations in particular countries where which fully embrace LGBTQI plus equality. Now, that's actually not the case across the whole of the Quaker movement, but certainly in New Zealand, in Australia, in Britain, in South Africa, and in other countries, it very much is the case, and it's very reliably the case, and people really find a home there. But I think there's also something about, wanting to find the divine, and, people maybe being pushed away from churches where there's been scandals, people who know the Bible very well, people who feel an experience of God's presence, but have maybe been in some kind of mega church where there's been some scandal with the pastor, and they want to, experience that New Testament Christianity in a different space. So another thing that's happening is a kind of influx of quite Christian young people, really excited about Jesus, excited about the Quaker space. And this kind of counters the story that's been told about Quakerism in New Zealand and Australia and Britain, which is the idea that it's becoming less Christian, more non-theist. That's true, and that's true amongst older generations. But what I'm noticing is that certainly amongst younger people coming to meeting, it's something similar to what inspired the first Quakers, the possibility of being the early church revived.
Do you see that you don't see non-theism as the future then?
No. It's growing more amongst older friends than younger friends, as far as I can tell. But the people who are arriving because they're searching for something religious, and they're finding it in a Quaker meeting.
Don't we need?
So that's going to be an interesting thing to hold together. But Quakers are good at holding together interesting things, so I've got no worries about this.
Don't we need a deeper theology and a deeper spirituality, so that we can feel some kind of hope, some kind of, that even when things go really badly, that hope is there, that the ground of the universe, the ground of life is real love and a lively hope.
I agree. And it sounds like you feel it. I feel it in a Quaker meeting. The metaphor we used at the beginning was the metaphor of the well, I often think a Quaker meeting in a circle looks a bit like the rim of a well, where we kind of lower our spiritual buckets to drink from the living water within and draw it back up. That's a thing. People feel better after a Quaker meeting than beforehand sometimes, on a good day. And, that is a source for that refreshment and sustenance.
If you've lost enough skepticism to actually drop your bucket in the well and hope to have something spiritual come out of that bucket.
Mm-hmm. Was that a question?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, let's stick with the metaphor. I have always liked the Quaker well. I've always liked going to Quaker meeting. I felt something there. I didn't use any words for it for 25 years. Never stood up and gave ministry, which is what people do when in the silence they feel moved to. But I always liked it. I liked the community. Nothing really to rebel against. Yeah, and then I began a process of seeing how deep this bucket can go. It's a lot deeper than I realized. And I found actually Christian words helped to do that, because it helped give a word for, what was inside this well. And then the last 4 or 5 years, I've been working for the Friends World Committee and meeting Quakers around the world. I've been realizing the breadth of the Quaker well. It's a lot broader than I ever realized. So now this kind of, my understanding of Quakerism, my way of engaging with the spirit, is much bigger than it used to be. And that's a wonderful experience. And I've even actually, I mean, part of my job is being the kind of person who's the contact for other international Christian organizations, other churches. And on occasion, I get invited to, occasions in the church, in the life of other churches. So it's interesting to visit other people's wells and see that they're clearly getting some sustenance from it too, even if that style really isn't for me. Um, so God is bigger than Quakerism. I always knew that, but it's good to experience it too.
One of the things I've always felt, and that if you go deep enough in the well, that you meet other faiths and other people in that well that are also searching for the divine and finding the divine.
Could you tell me more about that?
Well, the mystics of Buddhism or Islam or Judaism, the mystics and the mystics of Christianity have a lot more in common the deeper they go.
That makes sense.
That and I think you have to. Well, I have to try to let go of some of my autonomy to be open.
Yeah.
If there is God, and I depend on God to some extent, I don't mean somebody who's going to fix everything for me, but somebody who's going to support the goodness in life or forgiveness of, like, there was a Jewish woman, Etty Hilson, who wrote a very deep diary on the way while waiting to go to Auschwitz. And she talked about loving God and trusting God, even though you can't change my situation. You can't help me change that situation. But I'm grateful for your being, for your love, and want to love other people.
Yeah.
Sometimes I feel like modern liberal religious people are too skeptical. That somehow we want to be in charge. I'm not sure that we can be in charge.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think there's a tendency to want everything on our heads, to like quote this and that philosopher or poet or whatever that kind of comes out very nicely, might sound very rational. I don't know. If I read those kinds of books, sometimes I think people get stuck in our heads, and I think we need to transfer the place that we think about spiritual matters to our hearts. And then I think we can get somewhere else.
I think sometimes what we do with people and the experiences we have in the world can change our hearts. And this is why I have this strong belief that empathy comes from God. That so, what do young people ask you when you come across
What do young people ask me?
Yes.
That's a big question. I'm trying to think of I don't have like There's not like specific times when I'm talking to young people in particular, I don't think. So I'm not sure. I think young people and older people ask the same kinds of questions, I think, to me, at first at least. Because some of it's just the basics of what's Quakerism, what's my experience, and then people quite often want to share those. And then I love hearing them.
If in England and in New Zealand and Australia and other places, what do Quakers have to share or give, particularly to young people? Particularly, I think, considering that the world has become less stable
Mm.
in the last 10 years or so.
Yeah. Well, there's acceptance. That was why I was a Quaker as a young person. I like being accepted. There's community, there's intergenerational community. I think it's a rare opportunity to have genuine friendships with people who might be decades different in ages. I think that's actually, I can't think of another area of my life where I have that opportunity. I think that's something really special. I mean, there is the activism. The Quakers are active in the world in trying to make the world a better place. But then again, so are lots of other organizations. So that's not unique to us. And of course, when we do act, we often would do so with others who are working for the same cause. What we do off it, though, is that spiritual grounding, that rooting in hundreds of years of history, of continuing something. The idea that this conversation that you and I are having now, whatever we might do as Quakers in our lives, is a continuation of something someone like John Woolman was doing some centuries ago. And that what we are doing will contribute to the work and the witness of people in hundreds of years into the future. So we're able to see ourselves as a small part of this longer strand. And that's a really nice feeling that it's not all down to us. We're a small part of something bigger.
I guess one of the things that I think about is that for many people that well and that string goes back to Jesus. And I think he was crucified because he challenged the authority of power and the authority of inequality, and tried to find a way for ordinary people to live together in a world that was a positive way in very difficult situations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been an activist for all my adult life, and I find reading the New Testament in particular just eminently relatable, because if you've lived your life trying to make the world a better place and sometimes getting into some opposition with those who would want to keep things as they already are, then you can empathize with people across 2 millennia, especially the Gospels, especially Acts. It's very relatable. And in some ways, that's quite encouraging that we can see ourselves in this sacred text. In some ways, it's not, because, Jesus was crucified. But the point of the story, of course, is that the crucifixion wasn't the end. And I suppose that's what I was trying to say before, that whatever we do isn't the end either. It's continuing into something into the future.
So this is where your hope is based.
Well, I borrowed it from somebody else. I think it was an anti-racist writer talking about being a good ancestor. I like that. Trying to prepare the ground or sow seeds that others will cultivate. I mean, I see myself doing that. It's that cliche about standing on the shoulders of giants. Well, I'd like to offer some shoulders for other people to climb on too. I could do that. That seems achievable.
In a way, it seems to me that just keeping, for instance, the idea of economic democracy and economic equality alive is something worthwhile.
There's a lot of concepts we need to keep alive. Keeping the idea of democracy alive seems like a good idea right now. And
well, I think the two are very much connected, because I suspect the greatest difficulty democracy has is economic inequality.
I think that's probably true. And I think the lack of economic equality is probably what's leading to the decline in democracy in ways that are utterly predictable from a social scientific perspective, but not the kind of thing that you would read about in a newspaper, because they don't have an interest in promoting those kinds of viewpoints.
Well, thanks a lot for coming on board, and we'll have another conversation again.
Thank you very much.
And thank you. Well, we've just been talking with Tim G., who's the Secretary General of the Friends World Committee on Consultation, which is like the committee that keeps Quakerism connected around the world. Thank you very much for listening.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.